style of tune written especially for me, Strange Fruit. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
Flavia, you're on mute.
All right. So we want to welcome everyone to this evening's panel presentation. The title of our presentation this evening is Qualified Immunity Deconstructed, a psychoanalytic exploration of state-sanctioned dehumanization. It's a mouthful, but we hope that you'll stick with us. We'll be able to explain several of these terms throughout, and we hope that you leave away feeling informed and empowered to act. So let's get started. I want to introduce our illustrious panel. And share a little bit about why our panel is so special. We're moving on to the next slide. Okay, great. So our panel consists of a number of individuals. Some of them are psychologists, some are psychiatrists, all of them are Black. And what's really important to know about this very special group, in the United States, for all of those who are watching, only 13% of the population is Black. That's already a minority group, and a very small percentage of that group goes on to be psychiatrists or psychologists. 2% of psychologists practicing psychiatrists, are Black. 5% of practicing psychologists are Black. And even a smaller number, it's really less than 1%. What I have been quoted is 0.007% of individuals go on to practice psychoanalysis, which is a term that's going to be explained today. Psychiatrists, for those who are watching who don't know, are individuals who have medical degrees, who practice medicine and specialize in providing mental health services. Psychologists have often terminal degrees, and they specialize in providing psychological testing as well as clinical psychological services. And again, as will be explained a little bit later, you'll understand more deeply who psychoanalysts are. They really specialize in understanding the individual, helping to break patterns that are long-standing, especially from early on in life. So since I've just given you this backdrop, why don't I introduce the persons who will be speaking today. The first person that we have here is Dr. Ebony Dennis, and she is a proud Midwesterner. She's a Howard alum. She's on faculty at Washington Baltimore Institute of Psychoanalysis and is an adjunct at Howard University Medical School. She also is a clinical psychologist, and she's a psychoanalyst and is a member of the Holmes Commission on Racial Equity of the American Psychoanalytic Association. She has a thriving private practice in DC and also manages a psychological testing business. We also have Dr. Dunlap with us today, Dr. Constance Dunlap. She's a psychoanalyst and a board-certified psychiatrist in private practice in Washington, D.C. She is a proud graduate of the Georgetown University School of Medicine, as well as the George Washington Psychiatry Residency Training Program and the Washington Psychoanalytic Institute. She's a clinical professor of psychiatry in the George Washington University Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, where she supervises psychiatry residents who are learning to do intensive psychotherapy. She also is on the advisory board of Clinical Psychiatry News, where she's a contributing writer. Dr. Justin Hopkins, who is gracing us today, is a licensed clinical psychologist in Washington, D.C., District of Columbia. He operates a thriving psychotherapy practice for adolescents, adults, and couples, and is a consultant for NMASS, E-N-M-A-S-S-E Consulting. He has his bachelor's degree from Hampton University, master's and doctorate in clinical psychiatry from Regent University, and a postdoctoral study at Washington University. He really works with a wide range of individuals who come with a wide range of concerns, but he has a special expertise in trauma. And he uses his clinical expertise, life experience, and academic training to advise corporations on addressing societal traumas, confronting oppressive norms, and fostering equity and inclusion. Dr. Jessica Isom is an early community psychiatrist who is based out of Boston, Massachusetts at Codman Square Health Center. She's a public speaker, she's a medical educator, and a consultant for diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism projects. She is a leader within the American Psychiatric Association Assembly and has been elected, I think maybe even starting to serve as a counselor position for the Massachusetts Psychiatric Society. She also has a role within the Yale Department of Psychiatry Residency Program, where she's on faculty there, and she is working tremendously to start and to grow her consulting company, A Vision for Equity, which she intends to expand nationally to be a sought-out group of anti-racism coaches and organizational trainers. This really impressive group have provided DEI consultation to a number of different organizations nationally. So I started by introducing this really wonderful cohort, and I'll just share a little bit about myself. You might be wondering, who is this person speaking to you? And here I am in Washington, D.C., which is where I am now. I am born and raised in Jamaica, came to the United States for college, and spent some time after college working as a community organizer doing a number of different, working on a number of different strategy campaigns, police racial profiling issues, as well as environmental justice, then moving on to do some national food justice work. I pivoted into medical training and trained at Yale Medical School, continued on for residency, and I'm now in DC on faculty at Howard University, working in a clinical role as well as teaching medical students. I do some DEI consultation work as well, and I am really privileged to be able to moderate this panel this evening. So what I'm going to be doing for those who are here, you are welcome to drop your comments, questions in the chat. I'll be keeping an eye out on the chat room very closely. And we'll have an opportunity to go live in terms of interaction with our audience. You know, I'll be selecting from the chat room, and we'll be responding to those questions in between the different sections. We have 3 main sections here that we will be going through tonight, and I'm excited to participate and learn as much as you all are too. So let's get started with our presentation for this evening with Dr. Dunlap leading the way.
Good evening, and thank you, Dr. DeSouza. Next slide, please. We would like to start with a random tweet from March 18th of this year. It reads, "I'm stating the obvious, but a man was taken into custody alive after intentionally murdering 8 people. George Floyd was murdered by police in broad daylight and filmed, I think she meant filmed, for possibly using a fake $20 bill. And Breonna Taylor was sleeping. Okay, I just had to say it plainly." There's a massive historical backstory to the sentiment conveyed in this tweet, and it is the US's history of race, caste, and racism, and law enforcement's origins in slavery and its relationship with the Black community. And to further illustrate the point of the tweet, I invite you to join me in an exercise, and I invite you to attend to your own personal feelings. The tweet refers to the killing of 8 people in Atlanta, Georgia, 6 of them Asian women. When the 21-year-old white man, the alleged assailant, was apprehended, I, like many others, felt some measure of relief. He was off the streets. We could anticipate an investigation, prosecution, and if guilt was determined, an appropriate punishment. Now let's contrast that exercise, and again, pay attention to your feelings in this scenario. At the time of this recording, when we initially recorded this, there was an ongoing jury selection for the police officers charged in the killing of George Floyd. But we are beyond that, and the world knows the story, and we know that the murderer of Mr. Floyd has been convicted. But just some time before that, on August 11th, Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old Black man, was killed by police during a traffic stop. And the list continues to grow. Next slide, please. Why is that? Click, please. There are some disturbing statistics that I want to share. And so even after the conviction of Mr. Floyd, we remain concerned, and we would remain concerned for the following reasons. Police violence is the leading cause of death for young men of color. Next. The risk of being killed by police peaks between the ages of 20 and 25, between 20 and 35 for men of all racial and ethnic groups. The lifetime odds of being killed by police is 1 in 2,000 for men and 1 in 33,000 for women. Black, Native American, and Latino men and women are at higher lifetime risk of being killed compared to white men and women. Next. The risk is highest for Black men. 1 in every 1,000 Black men can expect to be killed by the police over the life course. Black people are almost 3 times as likely to die than whites as a result of excessive use of force by police. Next slide. The qualified immunity legal doctrine is responsible for nearly 100% exoneration of police officers charged with killings. And considering the numbers just cited, this is disturbing. Based on our research of this topic, we believe that the qualified immunity defense contributes to a dehumanizing experience for both the victim and the perpetrator, meaning those who are killed and those who are doing the killing. Next slide. Next slide, please. With that in mind, we, psychiatrists and psychologists, enter the fray on the matter of qualified immunity as follows. In part one of our presentation, we would define and review the history of the qualified immunity legal doctrine. We trace the historical arc of policing and review the scope of physical injury sustained in encounters with law officers. We then speak about the pivotal role of Black Lives Matter movement and the role it has played in raising global awareness and promoting advocacy. We would then shift to part two, where we do a deeper dive into the psychoanalytic dynamics involved. We review the role of mentalization, which we will explain, and we talk about how its failure leads to dehumanization. We discuss concepts such as the phobogenic object, projective identification, and we address America's perversion with violence. And in part three, we look at the effect of the qualified immunity doctrine on our conscience, our collective conscience, and we address some efforts to reform it. Next slide. Next slide, please. Before we proceed, I do want to share some disclosures. And one is, this talk is not personal. It's not meant to shame or blame. It's not motivated by anger, and it's not a partisan discussion. We believe that this is a discussion about human rights. We recognize that it may generate psychic tension. It may precipitate strong feelings like anger, anxiety, guilt, sadness, and shame. And it may activate coping mechanisms such as defensiveness. But we hope that you will stay with us, as Dr. Souza has invited you, because we think that this will actually be helpful in terms of educating and raising awareness. Next slide. Psychoanalysis is a powerful tool. And so, one of the questions is, well, how does it work? And before I get into that, I just want to review some basic definitions. For example, for those who are unclear, remember that psychiatrists are physicians. We're graduates of medical schools. We are trained to also treat psychological problems. We understand medicine, medical conditions, and we prescribe medications. And many of us do psychotherapy as well. Psychologists are graduates of doctoral level programs, and those with PsyD, the PsyD is Doctorate of Psychology, have specialized training and expertise in psychotherapy. Those of us who are psychoanalysts have advanced degrees and additional training, at least a minimum of 5 years on average. And sometimes we see patients for 4 days a week, which can be quite useful for those who have experienced trauma, which is why we want to see this promoted in our communities. And so this is actually an abstract schematic of an iceberg. And as you know, it's thought that only 10% of an iceberg is visible above the surface. And so we use that to illustrate that our conscious awareness only captures a fraction of what is happening with us as individuals. And so, for example, we can see someone's attitude, their speech, words, body language, and actions. But beneath the surface is a lot more. For example, you have prejudices, biases, fears, anger, dreams, and wishes. Next slide. Some of you may be familiar with the seminal work of the late Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, the author of the ISIS papers, The Keys to the Colors. Dr. Welsing used psychoanalysis to explain how anti-Black racism operates in our society. And she did so, and while doing so, she stood alone and was ousted by many of her community for truth-telling. And that includes the psychoanalytic community and other psychiatric communities. This is a quote from Dr. Dorothy Holmes, who is a psychologist, psychoanalyst, and I would say probably the most well-known Black psychoanalyst in the world. And we embrace this quote by Dr. Holmes, in which she says that traditionally major psychoanalytic organizations in the US and around the world have not generally focused on crimes against humanity as a focus of our work. But she says that we've not been focused on this, but psychoanalysis is a radical and progressive discipline, meaning that it aims to upset the status quo in order to make room for transformative progress in personal functioning. And so what she is addressing is that while we are able to look at our intrapsychic, which is in our minds, we're also able to use these theories, techniques, and concepts to look at group dynamics and societal dynamics as well. And so continuing in this vein, we apply these same tools to understanding the history and the evolution of law enforcement. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Isom.
All right, hello everyone. So I'm going to get started by offering some foundational terms, definitions, and a brief overview of qualified immunity. Okay, so it's a generic name describing activities of the agencies responsible for maintaining public order and enforcing the law, particularly those activities related to prevention, detection, and investigation of crimes and the apprehension of criminals. The other term that you see listed here is a bit more specific, and that is local law enforcement officer. That's describing an employee of a local law enforcement agency who is an officer sworn to carry out law enforcement duties. What I'd like to take a moment to identify here in the definitions is the word crime and criminal. The definition of these two words, crime and also the word criminal, actually shift and transform geographically across time and also across cultures. And as you'll hear more about later, the power to actually characterize who is defined as a criminal and what's characterized as a crime depends on those who are in power and often can be used as a tool of racial oppression. Although law enforcers describes a very broad category, for the purposes of our talk today, we are actually going to focus on police officers specifically, because what we're offering is an analysis of their psyche. So we've increasingly been hearing about in public discourse these terms, although for some of us it's been a lot more of our day-to-day conversation based on our positionality. And the first term is use of excessive force. This can be defined as the application of force beyond what is reasonably believed to be necessary to gain compliance from a subject in any given incident. And the second term, use of force, is the amount of effort required by law enforcement to gain compliance from an unwilling subject. What's really important to consider here is that the type of force and the intensity of that applied force actually can be shaped by the perceived humanity of the individual that you're interacting with, which makes the third term, dehumanization, very relevant here. This is defined as the act of perceiving victims as not fully human. And if we think about dehumanization, it's one way of explaining why there's the racialization of the use of excessive force, meaning that the humanity of some is not perceived, and that can result in a disproportionality in the excessive force experienced by that demographic. Now, the concept of qualified immunity has been a very controversial topic almost since its origin, and it's been around for decades, but more recently has become a part of the public discourse, largely rooted in the murder of Black men and women. And we've seen the violent, careless taking of Black lives for a very long time in this country. And it's very important that we have an intimate understanding of one of the ways that those lives are taken without any sort of consequence. So qualified immunity is a doctrine that essentially protects state and local officials, including law enforcement officers, from individual liability, unless that official violated a clearly established constitutional right. And we're just going to take a moment here to talk about the evolution of that over time. So in 1871, Congress adopted U.S. State Code, or the United States Code, 1983. And essentially what that offered to us as citizens is that we could bring lawsuits against public officials who violated our constitutional rights. In the decades that followed, actually almost a century that followed, there weren't a lot of public or citizens suing public officials. Yet interestingly, in 1967, the Supreme Court offered qualified immunity as a defense for public officials to use if those if people were bringing charges for constitutional violations. And what this means is that QI could be used to basically circumvent any claims that were brought forth against a public official by a citizen of the country. The plot thickened a bit because in 1982, there was an additional layer added, and that was this terminology of clearly established law. And that is the test for the doctrine, which basically says that you can actually apply qualified immunity to your case if the law a government official violated isn't clearly established. And we have some cases here for people who want to do a bit more of a deep dive, but we'll talk about what that means briefly on the next slide. And essentially, in summary, it translates to if there's no precedent for the constitutional violation in the court, then there is no clearly established law, which means there's no liability. So essentially, at the time that the official engaged in that conduct, if the law was sufficiently clear that every reasonable official would understand that what was done was unconstitutional, then they're liable. But if not, they're not liable. And what they say on paper is that this is supposed to essentially protect everyone except those who are plainly incompetent or those who knowingly violate the law. But it'd be really helpful to actually look at what is an example of something that's grossly a violation, but because of the qualified immunity doctrine was allowed to go without consequence. And one example of that is this case of Baxter, Alexander Baxter, who in early 2014 was bitten by a police dog, specifically a police dog that was unleashed on him as he was sitting on the ground with his hands in the air, having already surrendered. So of course, it makes sense that Alexander would pursue legal charges and enacted a lawsuit against the police for excessive force, because again, he was sitting on the ground and had already surrendered. But a federal appeals court a few years later actually threw out his case because they felt that the doctrine of qualified immunity applied. So what this translates to is that clearly established law is a very, very hard standard to meet. Essentially what it requires is that you, as the plaintiff, have to show that there was a prior case with very similar facts. And that essentially protects public officials from really any retribution, because oftentimes these clear constitutional violations just have not occurred before in a way that's able to be demonstrated. And Supreme Court Justice Sotomayor put it well, and this quote, qualified immunity quote, sends an alarming signal to law enforcement officers that the public essentially they can shoot first and think later, and the public appreciates that palpably unreasonable conduct will ultimately go unpunished. And that's where we are today. There are lots of opinions out there about qualified immunity, and some of the more recent polling shows that a majority of people, as demonstrated here in this Cato Institute survey results, actually do favor eliminating qualified immunity for police officers specifically. So that's in green, the majority. And then on the right, you can see that a majority of individuals, as reflected in the darker brown, do believe that civilians should have the power to sue police officers in order to hold them accountable specifically for excessive use of force or misconduct. At the same time, there are efforts around the country, still active federally and at the state level, that are working to address through modification or complete elimination of qualified immunity. And there's also states that are taking specific actions to address the legal liability of law enforcement officers for their excessive use of force or really any other unlawful actions committed by them. And we encourage you all to explore these in more detail as well. There are people out there who still oppose any changes to qualified immunity. They have a number of arguments listed out there, and we've put a couple of them for you here on the slide. The first, opposing it, is that we need qualified immunity so that the police won't hesitate when they have to make split-second life or death decisions. And another popular argument is that eliminating qualified immunity would negatively impact recruitment and retention of police officers because they would fear being sued. All of these arguments in opposition have been critically examined, and you can find some examples of that out there, including the reference we have listed here on this slide. And what I want to round out with for this section is an acknowledgement that it doesn't matter if you oppose qualified immunity or not. In reality, what we're really talking about here, the stakes that we're discussing here, are Black lives and those of other racialized minorities who are being disproportionately exposed to not just police violence in the form of causing death, but also police violence in other ways that we'll be discussing throughout today's presentation. We have here listed a graphic representation of just some of those names, beginning with A, B, C, and some of D, pulled from the Perception Institute. And these are all names that have represent human lives that were lost, specifically in relationship to police violence. So what we're now going to transition to is a discussion by Dr. Hopkins of the history of policing in the United States.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I believe the camera will switch over in just a minute. So I will be discussing the historical arc of U.S. law enforcement. And Dr. Dunlap and Dr. Dennis are psychoanalysts, yet we all are aware of psychoanalytic thinking, psychodynamic thinking, and I, in particular, I practice from a psychodynamic lens. And as analytic thinkers, we know that the past offers vital context for understanding and making meaning of the present. It's all but impossible to grasp the nuance and depth of our here and now without the historical context that birthed it. Next slide, please. Thanks. So how did we get there? The arc of police violence can be traced back to the genesis of police in this country. I will take you through that history, noting various milestones and pivotal developments along the way. And as you see here, this slide offers a brief timeline of American history and developments in law enforcement across several eras. Some of these are highlighted, such as the FBI's COINTELPRO, that's their counterintelligence program, and the war on drugs, which I will reference further as I move into those various periods. And one other thing worth noting before I continue is that the current doctrine of QI, qualified immunity, was adopted during the period of mass incarceration and after the civil rights movement. So more on that soon. Next slide, please. So the first system of order and control in America was the watchman system. At the time, America was still just a British colony, and citizens from each town patrolled their communities to maintain order. Next slide, please. As more and more slaves were trafficked into the country in the 1700s, slave masters established more formal groups to maintain power and control over a growing slave population. Slave patrols then developed as the earliest form of organized policing in America. And in order to thwart uprisings and prevent slaves from running away, slave patrols used vigilante tactics such as property raids, torture, and of course, even murder. Next slide. Yet and still, as the slave population continued to grow, slave masters had difficulty keeping slaves captive. There were countless slave rebellions as Black Americans drew strength from their numbers to try to escape bondage. The three rebellions here are among the largest slave rebellions documented. There's the Stonewall Rebellion in 1739, Gabriel's Conspiracy in 1800, and likely one of the largest revolts, Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, which resulted in over 100 enslaved Africans being executed. In response to these rebellions, the government actually adopted new laws to prohibit slaves from gathering together, from growing their own crops, or receiving any form of education. And in 1818, with slave rebellions on the rise, the duties of slave patrols were formally handed over to any police departments that were developed at the time. That is, the official business of standing police departments in the 1800s included enforcing and protecting the practice of slavery. There will be time to explore this further as we continue in this presentation, but it's worth noting that this is a very important piece of history that is known to very few. And in the words of Ibram X. Kendi, the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, denial is the heartbeat of racism. And part of that denial that keeps racism alive includes a very peculiar lack of knowledge or lack of acceptance around our racial history. Next slide. Take, for example, this patient who attended a session in June of 2020, a week after the death of George Floyd. the patient says, I did not know that police departments began in slavery, and I majored in history at a very fine university. I think about how much I don't know. The therapist responded, so you're feeling betrayed by your education. Many others are as well. And indeed, many people have felt betrayed by their education as they discover profound facts about our racial history long after formal and postgraduate education, post-college education. Just a few months ago, and I believe February of this year, 2021, a school in Utah initially allowed parents to opt out of Black history learning on behalf of their children. Next slide. So returning to our history, after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery in 1865, Black Americans remained the focus of policing efforts. Slave patrols dissolved just as formal police departments were developing, and their primary function, the primary function of those departments, particularly in the South, was to enforce, next slide, what are known as the Black Codes. So the Black Codes, or we could very well just call it slavery by another name, were a group of laws that were initially designed to ensure that formerly enslaved Black people would remain available for free or cheap labor. In many states, Black Americans at this time were mandated to sign yearly contracts for low-wage labor at the beginning of every year and show proof of employment to avoid being arrested. So being Black and idle in public was essentially criminal, particularly if you were not employed. Next slide, please. So now on to the 1880s through the 1950s, and really, Jim Crow ended in the late 50s, and with some states who adamantly wanted to keep some of their racist laws, you see these things kind of debated in court over and over and over, and the real impact of Jim Crow is actually felt for decades after. But during Jim Crow, during this time, there was segregation and discrimination that was explicitly legal. There were public lynchings that were a regular occurrence, and acts of terror were routinely carried out by the Ku Klux Klan. It wasn't uncommon to see lifeless Black bodies hanging from trees while police officers looked on in bemusement, or simply walked by while going about their day. So simply put, this is a time of state-sanctioned Black genocide. And at the time, many officers were also members of the KKK or empathized with their actions. So to be clear, this was a time when the most visible representatives of our criminal justice system either deliberately allowed Black violence to continue with impunity or participated in said violence themselves. Next slide. I'm going to take a brief moment to invite Dr. Dunlap back in.
Okay, and can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you? Okay, and I'm not going to be do a spotlight. This is an image of on the left of two teenagers, Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith in Marion, Indiana on August 7th. And the lyrics of the poem Strange Fruit, which were published in 1937 at the height of Jim Crow segregation, was inspired by the lynching of these two teenagers, the public lynching. The song was made popular by Miss Holiday, who was threatened by the government for singing it. And I'll just read the words. Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood on the roots. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the popular trees.
Thank you, Dr. Dunlap.
Sure.
Next slide, please. So now we're going to move into the civil rights era, and there is an unfortunate typo on this slide. It says 1860s. We are now moving into the 1960s. And this isn't the civil rights era, which is 1950s and 1960s, actually. And during this time, Black Americans started to protest the maltreatment that they experienced from law enforcement during the Jim Crow era. And during that time of protests, law enforcement was deployed to thwart their peaceful protests. They were sprayed, the protesters were sprayed with fire hoses, attacked with police dogs, and beat with batons, all while remaining peaceful. And the gruesome violence visited upon protesters is what led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation and made employment discrimination illegal. But nevertheless, a rather consistent pattern continued to unfold. And that is, as Black Americans gained more rights, police departments received new marching orders to criminalize, control, and suppress Black Americans. It's also worth noting again here that this is the era that qualified immunity was first established. Its current doctrine was established back in 1982, but the first draft of the doctrine was adopted during the Civil Rights era. Next slide, please. So from the 1970s into the 1990s, politicians and law enforcement worked in tandem to systematize the mass incarceration of Black Americans. In 1971, law enforcement carried out President Nixon's war on drugs, which disproportionately targeted Black Americans and promoted the myth that drugs were more prevalent within Black communities. President Clinton's 1994 crime bill further targeted Black Americans with political rhetoric around crime in urban cities. And John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, co-organized Nixon's initiatives. And I highlight him because we're going to come back to him in just a moment. But first, let's look at the fallout from some of these policies. Next slide. And you can here click once, click twice, and continue to click through until you see 2 on the bottom. Thank you. So I'll read through some of these statistics, which are actually quite startling. You can keep clicking, there's about 3 more. Thanks. So first, according to the US Department of Justice, between 1979 and 2009, the prison population in America grew over 500%. That's 5 times its population over a 30-year period. Our inflated prison population is disproportionately represented by nonviolent drug-related offenses, as 1 in 5 incarcerated individuals is locked up for a nonviolent drug offense. Black and white Americans sell and use drugs at similar rates. That is a very stable and consistent statistic that we find over the years when looking at the rates of drug use. But Black Americans are 2.7 to 6.5 times as likely to be arrested for drug-related offenses. Currently, Black Americans represent 34% of the prison population, yet are only 13% of the entire US population. And if current trends continue, 1 in 3 Black men will serve time in prison. And lastly, there are more Black people in prison today than were enslaved in 1850. I want to be transparent and say this is partly due to the fact that there are more people in America than were in 1850, but the toll of human suffering has continued and even magnified further in that regard. Next slide. So I want to take a moment just to return to John Ehrlichman, President Nixon's domestic policy advisor, who helped him craft the war on drugs. In a 1994 interview, long after the Nixon administration ended, he interviewed with an author by the name of Dan Baum, who wrote the book Smoke and Mirrors, The War on Drugs and the Politics of Failure. John Ehrlichman had this to say. He says, the Nixon campaign in 1968, so this is almost 3 decades later that he's sharing this, in 1968, and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So Black people were criminalized by law because the Nixon administration wanted to go to war with Vietnam, and Black Americans were largely opposed to it. Now, we reviewed the developmental history of law enforcement in America, not because we hate the police or because we are anti-law enforcement, but rather to illuminate that law enforcement, as an arm of government, has been used to carry out the policies and desires of powerful white people over and over again. Law enforcement's use and dehumanization of Black bodies is perpetuated by the government with little moral compromise, because both policies and the foundational culture of law enforcement and our criminal justice system make it acceptable. Next slide. So I'll pass it on to Drs. Isom and Dunlap.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hopkins. So Dr. Isom and I are going to cover the visceral experience of excessive and lethal police use of force. Oh, I'm sorry, before we do that, I understand that there's a question for Dr. Hopkins.
Sure.
Yeah, so we have a question here from one of our YouTube viewers, and it sounds like it's a historical question, and so we'll do our best to answer it. Dr. Hopkins, I understand that Reconstruction was a brief period in the US history when this country was trying to make strides and do right by Black people. Is that accurate?
In theory, yes. In theory, Reconstruction was a time in history where we were supposed to reconstruct society so that former slaves could be US citizens endowed with all the rights and privileges that humans have in this country. But in reality, what really happened after the Civil War, the leaders of the Confederacy were actually allowed to take up prominent positions in government in the South. Right? We see a political divide in our country now, and if you trace kind of that divide, you can see where the further in the South there are certain beliefs, further in the North there are different, more liberal beliefs, and at that time, right? So these are people who led the mutiny, who caused the Civil War and separated from the nation in order to keep slaves. And then they were allowed government positions such as Senate seats, as well as governors. So you can see how the idea of Reconstruction didn't actually really live up to its actual intention. There were so many roadblocks and so much political opposition that the effects of the Black codes, Jim Crow, were felt long after. And there were more policies as well that just furthered Black oppression.
And that's so great. Thank you so much, Dr. Hopkins. It just speaks to how important it is to know our history, because it continues to impact us and maybe even inform our thinking and behavior to this day. And thanks so much for that. So we're going to transition here into the next section, the visceral experience of excessive and lethal police use of force. Dr. Dunlap.
Okay. All right, let me ask if my camera has been adjusted okay. I understand there was some
You look
fantastic
earlier. Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, next slide. Okay, and so one of the things that we want to focus on right now is a concept called repetition compulsion. And one thing that we know from our research is that our current system, and also from the history that Dr. Hopkins just reviewed, you can see how our current system is set up to sustain some unhealthy, unconscious patterns in society. And today, nearly a century later, we continue to witness what is considered to be strange fruit, referring to lynchings, only now populating the pavements of our city streets. And we're referring to victims murdered by vigilantes, uniformed men and women endowed with the permission to empower to police our communities, but not just law enforcement. Other people are feeling that they have the right to also decide who should live and who should die. And the repeated killings of these men, women, and children produce strong psychological reactions. By now, more Americans are familiar with the expression driving while Black. But over the past 2 decades, that has morphed into the notion of sitting in your living room, eating ice cream while Black, sleeping while Black. The point is that there is now a lot of anger, sadness, rage, and fear, because of these behaviors. And, getting back to that notion of the iceberg, If there is something underneath the surface, like racism and bias, if it is not addressed, we will continue to act on it and act out. And that's what we mean by the repetition compulsion. The past will unconsciously repeat itself if we do not process it. And we are compelled to repeat what we do not acknowledge and understand. And you can see here, the top image is image of people, publicly witnessing a lynching. And at the bottom, there is the body of Michael Brown, laid out on a pavement. And when you think about the concept of dehumanization, this is something that Isabel Wilkerson mentioned at the APA annual meeting this year. One evidence of the dehumanization is we see people who are killed and no one is offering them medical aid, first aid. They're being killed and they're allowed to die. And of course, the image on the right is that of George Floyd dying. Next slide, please. This is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is, really insightful. And I think of him as really carrying the work that James Baldwin did, back in the 50s and 60s. And what this quote captures from Ta-Nehisi Coates, and this is from the, letter to his son, Between the World and Me. And what he says is, and I'm just going to read it, he says, but all our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, these terms serve to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, and breaks teeth. And he says to his son, you must never look away from this. You must always remember that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs, the charts, the regressions, all land with great violence upon the body. And what we're going to shift to is actually what is happening, because often what we hear about only are the murders. Next slide, please. So this information is from some really important work that was done by the National Medical Association, and it's taken from a press release that was issued July 18, 2016. And this highlights the summary of their work. And they did research, and summarized that use of force injuries occur in three phases: pre-custody, custody, and post-custody. And so pre-custody, you have, that includes the commission of a crime during a fight or chase, apprehension, during a siege or hostage situation, or during restraint or submission. And there's been a lot of attention to that lately. Injuries in custody occur soon after being admitted to jail, during interrogation, incarceration, and even during legal execution. And the post-custody injuries include revenge by police or rival criminals, and also after re-entry into the community. And so once one has been incarcerated, they're still at risk of being injured. Next slide. And so here is a list of the range of injuries sustained. And we take the time to review this because, and I'll speak personally, when Freddie Gray was injured and we heard about his spinal cord injury, I realized in retrospect that I thought that was rare, but that's not so. The range of injuries sustained during encounters with police include choking due to positional or upper body holds, cuts and bruises, gunshot wounds, which we hear about, concussions, skull fractures, cervical spine injuries, facial fractures, blunt trauma, orbital floor fractures, laryngeal cartilage fractures, shoulder dislocations, hemorrhage, abdominal trauma, hemothorax, pneumothorax, and broken legs. Next slide. And the complications of such injuries include infections from open fractures, infections from lacerations, hydrocephalus due to blood or infection, and that's a buildup of fluid, subdural hematomas, epidural hematomas, post-traumatic brain swelling, and in the most severe cases, death. Next slide. And so, one of the questions that occurs is, well, why is this happening? And why is this happening really disproportionately to Black and Brown and other marginalized people? And this slide addresses the concept of mentalization. One thing that we know is that this process that we're talking about starts early. And it starts first because of a failure of mentalization. Mentalization refers to the ability to understand one's own and another's mental state, which includes expressions, feelings, desires, purposes, and reasons. When we miss and don't think about who is in front of us and don't see that they are someone's child, parent, sibling, that they are a person who has relationships and are a part of humanity, we can easily misread them and not see them all together. Some whites simply cannot see Blacks. And we're familiar with the notion of, the gaze being averted when someone Black is passed. Not seeing results in not trusting. One thing we know is that whites trust police and in general, police trust whites, which might explain why on January 6th at the Capitol, the police officers did not shoot the mob of insurgents violating the boundaries of the Capitol while Congress was in session, even though there were threats to lynch the vice president, among others. Later, we'll talk about projection and projective identification and break down what occurs, because that also is involved in this process. And the bottom line is, if you're not able to see someone, we have this expression, I see you. If you can't see the person, you don't treat them as a person. And this is what results in dehumanization. It results in not attuning. It results in the overestimation of the age of boys and girls. It's resulting in the apprehension of younger and younger children. That includes school suspensions and arrests. It results in pepper spraying a 9-year-old. It results in this cradle to the prison pipeline and the killing of youth. Next slide. And there are various ways to dehumanize. Adultification is referred to as, it's a social or cultural stereotype that is based on how adults perceive children in the absence of knowledge of children's behavior and verbalizations. In other words, instead of seeing the innocence that all children possess, adultification involves projecting, that is, giving grown-up qualities and attributing negative motivations to children. And one example that we have adopted in the Black community, and I'm just going to call this out, is this notion of calling boys little man. In some ways, we know that it's an effort to prepare boys for the challenges of society, but a boy is a boy. He is not a little man. Adultification is also used to promote stereotypes about girls. So for example, and this happens with boys and girls, someone 13 can be assumed to be 6 years older. So a 13-year-old might be assumed to be 19. And especially, for example, like with boys who are, tall, this is one reason we're so concerned about our Black sons. But let me just stay with the girls for the moment. Adultification results in these myths about Black girls. And there's a myth that Black girls are more independent, need less nurturing, less protection, need to be supported less, and need to be comforted less. There's also this myth that Black girls know more about adult topics and more about sex. And I can just tell you, traditionally in communities, that is just not the case. But we also see this continuing into adulthood. And so we end up having some of these myths that accompany Black women into adulthood and into other settings. Next slide. Dr. Isom.
Yeah, thank you. We want to take a moment just to pull in a recent piece that came out in the New York Times, highlighting one of the ways, and one of the questions we want you all to consider for any institution is, how is racism operating here? And there's so many ways, so many mechanisms for racism, and this is just one. So the New York Times article is called titled "How a Genetic Trait in Black People Can Give the Police Cover." And what they're referencing is sickle cell trait, which is common in descendants from any geographic location where there is a high level of malaria. So Black people, having been brought from a geography that had that, in the US context, represent one of the larger groups that have sickle cell trait. That sickle cell trait, quoted from the New York Times article, has been cited in dozens of police custody deaths ruled accidental or natural, even though the condition is benign on its own. So here we have, to put a face to the story, Dean Smith, who died in police custody in Indiana, handcuffed and gasping for air. And the ruling, which is a sort of a complicit interaction between the medical examiner and the police force, was that it was an accident caused by sickle cell crisis. So in this New York Times article, it's very painful to read. It's very tragic to read. It details a number of cases where this sickle cell trait language was included in medical examiner reports, and that ultimately shaped the kind of response after, which ultimately were that no charges were brought or no suspicions were surrounding those deaths in police custody. So check that out as one example of one of the really sinister ways that racism can operate underneath the surface. And I appreciate the New York Times for calling that out. I'll pass it back to you, Dr. Dunlap.
Okay, this is a slide, and it highlights a quote from a researcher, Monica Blumenthal. And we include this because it seems that killing seems to be the only indicator of harm to Black people, and that is because it seems to be the only injury generally that makes the news. And one thing that we've noticed is that when an action is called violent, the public becomes more willing to control that action with measures that are literally violent, that is, with police acts that will lead to substantial injury or death. But we do see a shift in that, which Dr. Dennis is going to address, because protests has caused a shift in the way that we're viewing protests and also the response by law enforcement. Okay. And I will turn it over to Dr. Dennis.
Great, thank you, Dr. Dunlap. Greetings, evening. I'm breathing a little bit heavy over here. It's emotional. There's been so much that's unknown in this country. Well, buried, dissociated, split off, denied, rationalized, and hidden. Protesting eviscerates the acronym defensive tactics. In a democracy, we have the right to peacefully protest. The motivation, role, function of protest is to raise awareness. Us in the psych field call that raising consciousness, which requires disruption, good trouble to disturb status quo thoughts and behaviors. Let's move to the Black Lives Matter organizers. In 2013, these three powerful young Black women began the Black Lives Matter movement. Through their Black Lives Matter movement passion, they illuminated for those who would not and could not see the impact of excessive lethal force by police and even non-law authorities on Black people. The BLM movement was a rejection, a refusal to accept projections that we, Black people, are dangerous, less than, thus unworthy of equitable protection, rights, privileges, dignity, empathy, and basic human regard. The BLM movement inspired many more people to metaphorically stand alone and risk their dream job. It understood that those 1, 2, 3 folks at your job or in your organization who are Black and actually speak up about these issues, it's taxing, it's wearing. We're all tired around these matters. We don't want to have to deal with it, but compelled to. And the tax is aptly called the Black tax, dealing with this stuff. Let's move to civil rights. I love this image, and I hate this image. Nothing's changed, it seems. For almost 80 years, Black mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts, adolescents, children have walked out of their homes knowing that they might die, be murdered, to protest equal rights. And I think that civil rights has been conflated with Black rights. That's not the case. We're fighting for everybody's human rights. Today, we see a more collective ethno-racial presence protesting, which just invigorates me. And this is raising the consciousness that Black lives matter. And because Black people anchor this nation's racist ideologies and practices, if we can pull this heavy anchor into consciousness, we can become freed up to move in a different direction with all marginalized people, to include poor, disenfranchised whites. All right, let's move to the next slide, please. This is our question. We attempt here to understand and in part why Black Americans are so feared and attacked, and whites are immune, so immune to punishment for such attacks. This is baffling. Let's move to the next slide. And as the Black Lives Matter movement has garnered support across demographic lines, can you move to the next slide? Thank you, guys. As there's been more global support around the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a corresponding defensiveness to it. Police violence has intensified, making it ever more important to pull up this racist anchorage, understand it, dismantle it, reconstruct for real. Let's move to the next slide, please. Something shifted after the murder of Mr. George Floyd last May. Many who had turned a blind eye maintained the murdering and mistreatment of Black people in their unconscious could no longer reasonably deny the truth. Many began to question law enforcement's excessive use of force and reevaluate their perceptions and positions on how law enforcers and their policies, which we really want to emphasize policies, because these young men and women, some of them are following policy and tactics to include invoking martial force on peaceful protesters. Let's move to the next slide. And moving to this next slide, we're going to try to understand this from a psychoanalytic perspective, which is the only theory that has cogently explained what has confused and disturbed me since I was a child. How can Black human beings be so easily harmed and killed for no reason? I mean, children even, and with no, babies even, and with no consequence in a country that is so lauded or lauds itself. And this is me as a proud patriot saying this. What we are about to show you is going to be difficult to see. We're going to get into some dynamic work here. Please protect your psyche. Look away or leave the space if you need to. Me, I haven't watched any of the videos of people who look like me being killed. I can't take it. This is me, and I hear about it in the consultation space. If you can stick it in with us, as Ta-Nehisi Coates encourages his son, we're about to walk in the proverbial shoes of a Black man through 3 vignettes. And we'll discuss and provide psychoanalytic definition and context to the violent dynamics they consistently, persistently are faced with. We'll apply theory in a loosely developmental sequence, and all of the doctors here will chime in on these complicated dynamics. I hope everyone takes their mute off. And if you guys in the chat room see anything we missed, because it's, I mean, it's quick, it's nuanced, please offer. All right, let me set up the video. So as you view this video, which is a common experience of each of us as presenters, I want you to think about what it does to the psyche to receive constant messages. You're unwanted, don't belong, criminal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You might be able to relate to this term, similar gaslighting. They're both literally crazy making, like detached from reality. That's crazy. And can lead to one being vulnerable to projections. For example, am I in the wrong place? Did I do something wrong? Is there something wrong with me? Okay, let's play this video. Thank you. W. Du Bois wrote, "It's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One never feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts." Excuse me, one ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideas in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. It's interesting, keeps it. It's dehumanized even there. That's where it takes you. This video also demonstrates what legal scholar Sean Field describes in his law paper, Weaponized Racial Fear, what he calls the fourth wave of racial fear in white Americans. And that is that white Americans expect a ghettoized version of African Americans. By ghettoized, he means the media version, such as evidenced by the slide of Nixon's domestic policy advisor, policymaker, of Black people as being poor, ignorant, drug users, and prone to criminality, and not belonging in what Fields calls white space, a term Dr. Dunlap used earlier in the presentation. Hence, Black people are seen and understood, wanted when they're in servile roles. You know, we can be seen if we're the waiter. We can be seen if we're doing some kind of task with the white gaze. But we're felt to be suspicious and not wanted or belonging in the affluent spaces of academia, leadership, government, high-ranking military, or middle to wealthy class neighborhoods. Let's move to Fanon. Doctors Isom and Hopkins have provided some of the systemic reasons we look and treat Blacks and Black males in particular as nefarious criminals. Let's look at how the societal mother, so to speak, influences the psyche of the child or porous adult. And by porous, I mean influenceable adult, a follower. At about the same time Sigmund Freud was practicing in Vienna, Frantz Fanon, of mixed ethnicity, who identified as Black, was developing his thoughts and theories about the impact of being colonized by the French on his island of Martinique. Through his experience growing up and witnessing colonization, he theorized that the Black male was morphed into what he called a phobogenic object. I think he's right on point. Phobias are developed as a way to take an unconscious fear, meaning a fear that is intolerable to be aware of, and project that fear onto something which one feels more acceptable to fear. So that fear, anxiety can actually find some outlet of expression. Some socially accepted fears, for example, would be the fear of spiders, snakes, pit bulls, and Black men. Black males have been utilized in this way for centuries. Sure, there's some element of danger in all of these socially acceptable fears. For example, the spider and snake may be poisonous, but most aren't. And the pit bull jaw strength has the capacity to kill if abused or provoked. And the Black male's DNA is dominant, has dominant genes and the capabilities of browning the nation, which is an annihilation loss fear for some white Americans. And I understand that. In this manner, Frantz Fanon used the term phobogenic object to highlight the unintegrated phobic fear material that Black men evoke or tap into for white America. Frantz Fanon defined the phobogenic object as something, or rather someone, whose mere presence evokes fear, personal insecurity, revulsion, dread. And this isn't the time where we can talk about this personal insecurity that Black men bring up and the envy that is felt toward them. Not for this presentation, but Fanon further causes dynamic scapegoating, a hate for one's victim proportionate to the guilt one feels for the amount of injustices and violence one has subjected them to. Similar to like white guilt. We posit that the policy of qualified immunity is one of many tactics in our government to offer legal justification and perverse permission for the white ego to project unwanted and unintegrated primitive fears into Black people. When any ego is unable to integrate the good and bad parts of the self, the ego is weakened. I believe this is how to psychoanalytically describe what Robin DiAngelo calls white fragility. So for example, if you can only look at your good parts right over here and say your significant other says, hey, you did something wrong. If you can only see your good parts, you'll say, no, you're all wrong. And that's going to cause problems in the relationship. In fact, the relationship probably won't work. If you can only see your bad parts and somebody says, oh, you did this really good thing, you'll deny it and you won't even be able to reach your potential and be able to understand who you really are. So there's fragility there. But if you're able to integrate both, there is a strength in knowing who one is, and then the ability to interact with another successfully. It's called a relationship, healthy relationship with the self and the other. All right, let's move on to some more theory, Klein. So we've mentioned the concept of ego, which is basically where our defenses live. To be extremely simplistic, you have a strong ego if you are able to integrate your good and bad parts, and your ego is weaker if you're unable to integrate. You split off, you dissociate, you project parts of yourself that are uncomfortable to you. And interestingly enough, it could be your good parts as well. Let me say this right now too, that it's a little bit tricky, some of the stuff that we're about to talk about, but these dynamics are tricky. I think that's why they're the only way I've been able to understand them with Klein's theory. So according to Melanie Klein, our defenses begin to develop in utero and in infancy. During our infancy, we're at our most vulnerable state. We're merely trying to survive in this new world and space outside of the womb. It's scary. Hence, the defenses developed during this period are early, primitive, and unsophisticated, so to speak. And by primitive, we don't mean anything derogatory, just that they're early, like the beginnings of. For those of you who've been around an infant and seen an infant in distress, I mean, they're crying, they can turn red, they start to shake, they can even choke on their own breath. It's an extreme experience to witness and certainly to go through. And according to Klein, during these moments, the infant is experiencing annihilation, death anxiety, because the infant mind has a limited capacity to process the experience that the other, who might be the mother, is going to take care of them. So they see things in black and white, pun intended, that either you're good if you gratify or you're bad and persecutory if you don't gratify. It really has to be that simple. This is instinct. We're mammals. Without the mother, we would actually physically or psychically die. Hence, when the infant is in distress, how the other does or does not respond to the infant's needs impacts their defensive development. For example, infants who do not get what they need in order to psychically survive the fear of death, they usually, they'll use more primitive defenses such as splitting, dissociation, projection, and to survive those emotional moments. It allows the infant to have, the defenses allow the infant to have some psychic control and a way to feel safe. When we dissociate when something's really scary, or we hum, sing, these are ways that we can keep ourselves intact in a scary moment. Klein calls this position of how you look at the self and other as good or bad, the paranoid schizoid position, meaning you have a paranoid, watchful stance of the other, and they're split in a schizoid way as good and bad. The infant who needs to use these defenses more because lack of care will be the adult that has these defensive operations that are very developed, these primitive defensive operations. I can see it right when people sit in the consultation space, or if even at a restaurant, I can see how people cope. If it can give us information about, how well they were able to be taken care of. Conversely, the infant who receives what they need in infancy will still have the primitive defenses. However, they'll use them less, thus be able to integrate the good and bad in both themselves and the other. And Klein calls this the depressive position. It's depressive because you're not all good and they're not all bad. It's reality. It's a real relationship. Nonetheless, no matter how well we're taken care of as infants, we all can oscillate into a paranoid schizoid position when we feel like our life is in danger. So what does this have to do with this topic? We posit that many white people in the presence of the Black male, either consciously or unconsciously, feel they're in danger. This can lead to an oscillation into the paranoid schizoid stance. This can be exacerbated by a few factors. One, if the white person is prone to oscillating into a paranoid schizoid position, uses primitive defenses quite often, has a weaker ego, unintegrated ego. Two, fears Black males in some form or fashion. And if you add to that dynamic what law enforcers are charged to do, the policies, the practices, complaints of lawless Black people, danger, projection, projective identification, and the Black male phobogenic object, who is not the ghettoized, expected Black male in white space, causes confusion, distress, and fear, and possibly irrational defensiveness. This is what we see when we see these videos of these police officers, like going from 0 to 100 real quick. So let's see if you can recognize some of these dynamics in the next vignette. So let's set this up. So this video is about 1 minute, 20 seconds of a highly broadcast YouTube video. Miss Cooper's behavior with Mr. Cooper, a Black man, seems disturbed. Nonetheless, we don't want her demonized. Remember that she's only doing what society has taught her. The American superego has sanctioned her for generations, that she can take her id, fears, and aggressive impulses and use the Black man to process it. Those who are able to stick in, which might be difficult, please try to keep your mental health, psychodynamic hats on, and we can discuss this later in the hour.
Please don't come close to me. Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Would you please stop? Sir, I'm asking you to stop.
Please don't come close to me.
Sir, I'm asking you to stop recording me.
Please don't come close to me.
Please take your phone off.
Please don't come close to
And
me.
I'm taking a picture and calling the cops.
Please call the cops. Please call the cops.
I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life.
Please tell them whatever you like.
Excuse me? I'm sorry, I'm in a ramble, and there is a man, African-American, he has a bicycle helmet. He's recording me and threatening me and my dog. There is an African-American man, I am in Central Park. He is recording me and threatening myself and my dog. And my... I'm sorry, I can't hear you either. I'm being threatened by a man in the ramble. Please send the cops immediately. I'm in Central Park in a ramble. I don't know.
Thank you.
I don't imagine this woman took a class on how to terrorize Black people and risk their lives by calling the police. This is an example of transgenerational transmission of fear-based feelings and sadistic practices of trauma and pattern attack of innocent Black people. Hence, let's use Ms. Cooper as a symbol mental representation of white power, entitlement, anxiety, and fear of the Black male, and corresponding pattern entitlement to use police, who many don't want to be used in this way, as a weapon to defend against irrational fears symbolized by and displaced onto Black males, similar to how phobias are developed, as we discussed earlier. I think this is irrefutable that this demonstrates that white citizens are aware of their power and privilege of what to say to the police to get a weaponized response to protect the white person from their discomfort, be it rational or irrational. Let's move to our next vignette. Again, if you need to protect yourself defensively to this material I'm about to read, please do. I mean, I sobbed when reading it the first several times of this young man, in my opinion, having been murdered. Mr. McLean is a 23-year-old Black male, was an animal lover, massage therapist who taught himself to play the guitar and violin. In fact, he would play the violin to stray cats, believing this would soothe the animals. Elijah was walking home from the store while listening to music in his earphones. He was wearing a ski mask and waving his arms. I imagine he might have been enjoying his music. Someone called 911 reporting that there was somebody sketchy in the neighborhood. Police arrived and Elijah said he wanted to go home. Police grabbed Elijah, who tried to wiggle away. The police told him, "Stop tensing up." Elijah pleaded for him to let him go. continuing attempt to wiggle out of their hold. Police escalated with using a carotid hold, AKA chokehold, which restricted blood to his brain, causing unconsciousness. Let's read what was caught on the cameras. I can't breathe. I have my ID right here. My name's Elijah McClain. That's my house. I was just going home. I'm an introvert. I'm just different. That's all. I'm so sorry. I have no gun. I don't do that stuff. I don't do any fighting. Why are you attacking me? I don't even kill flies. I don't eat meat, but I don't judge people. I don't judge people who do eat meat. Forgive me. All I was trying to do was become better. I will do it. I will do anything. Sacrifice my identity. Right there, he shifted to doing anything, being whatever they needed him to be. I'll do it. You are all phenomenal. Genuflecting. You are beautiful and I love you. Try to forgive me. I'm a mood Gemini. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ow, that really hurt. You're all really strong. Teamwork makes the dream work. Crying. Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to do that. I just can't breathe. After restraint on the ground, Elijah vomited several times, for which he stated, I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to do that. I can't breathe correctly. Paramedics arrived and gave Elijah a dose of ketamine appropriate for a 190-pound male. Elijah was 140 pounds. Elijah went into cardiac arrest on his way to the hospital and died days later. All the police cameras had fallen off at that point. We didn't get any more information. Let's move to the next slide. If we looked at these reactions and behaviors clinically, we would definitely have a diagnosis to give for the police officers, for Ms. Cooper. Nonetheless, these beliefs and corresponding behaviors are so baked in the American psyche, it is difficult to recognize for some. However, marginalized people who do not privilege white humanity, along with some whites around the globe, look at our behavior, American behavior, and experience it as primitive and perverse. Adrian Harris, a white Canadian-born psychoanalyst, writes that part of the perversion of white Americans is our ability to disassociate, disavow, forget, and refuse another's humanity. Think of the pact as a double entendre, like a wolf pack. White people stick together to try to keep their ruse going. This too is why the white ego is often weak. Some have not had a chance to stand up or autonomously express their individual convictions. And those who do go off the path, I've seen it happen. They're viciously attacked by the wolf pack. Let's move to the next slide. So Dr. Anton Hart, a psychoanalyst and psychologist, articulated this point well. He writes, racism is so perniciously destructive because it represents an exploitative, dehumanizing vehicle for the racist management of overwhelming vulnerability. Acts of discrimination and racial hatred provide a channel for the racist's own intolerable destructive thoughts and feelings to find interpersonal expression through use of a stranger, while simultaneously being disavowed through the racist locating the badness and the provocation in that strange other. This bad, defective, dangerous other can be hated so that the good, sound, safe self can be loved, and the sense of personal goodness can be maintained. Dr. Hopkins and I will now work together to show you how these complex millisecond dynamics work using the vignettes we just played, along with some cartoons.
Thanks, Dr. Dennis. And I look forward to conversing with you about these concepts because they are complex, and we really hope to illuminate it for our audience. And what you mentioned at the top of your portion is that these concepts and this theory, psychoanalytic theory, it's helped us to put words to what we experience and what we've witnessed, which has for so long been incredibly confusing and disillusioning. So before I continue from here, I just want to again articulate that, from our psychoanalytic lens, that we believe that all humans have a conscious and an unconscious mind, and our mind performs countless unconscious functions in order to maintain psychological equilibrium, a space where we feel a decent amount of comfort. And those functions are called defense mechanisms, and they make it easier to deal with reality by keeping parts of it out of our conscious awareness. So some defenses are more sophisticated than others, yet the further a defense takes us away from reality, the further away, the more unsophisticated that defense is said to be, or the more primitive, the more nascent. Projection is considered a more unsophisticated defense because it results in a sizable departure from an aspect of reality. And although it does serve to protect one's psychological equilibrium, as all defenses do, it does leave one's ego and their psychological equilibrium, that space of maximized comfort, in a fragile state, because we're always interacting with reality, right? And so when we are confronted with things that our mind has worked to keep out of our conscious awareness, that there's psychological disequilibrium, which can be quite challenging. Next slide, please. So we've talked quite a bit about projection, but what is projection exactly? Well, here's our definition. Projection is a defense mechanism in which an individual projects qualities about oneself that are too terrifying and unbearable to accept onto another person. They then become blind to the undesirable qualities they possess and experience the other person as possessing them as if it were so. Projection is typically used precisely because a truth about oneself cannot be accepted. Because to accept something unbearable as being true about oneself can be woefully destabilizing for that person, which is actually scary and quite threatening. It's as if to say, if I were to accept these terrible things as coming from me and not the other person, who would I be? Who am I actually? And when we can't tolerate that or answer those questions or really engage with those questions, the truth is instead denied. And yet also those parts of ourself are expressed through our engagement in perception and experience of the other person that we've projected into. And in the American context, what is projected is the knowledge of the crimes of white supremacy and the systemic racism it supports in present day, the recurring violence, oppression, and inequality Black Americans endure, and the privileges that are granted to white Americans vis-a-vis this dynamic. And we have two really clear examples of that. One is the pathologizing and magnification of Black crime, and the other is the trope of the cowboys and Indians, that age-old trope. So for the first one, often Black people are thought of as being more prone to criminality and thereby in need of more policing, without acknowledging, completely separated from the reality of the centuries of enslavement, of systemic oppression, of financial disenfranchisement. And in 1993, we have the New Deal that took us out of the Great Depression. And that New Deal shaped our middle class to what it is today. And Blacks were excluded from that, completely excluded. So we see that the racial gap in finances has not really budged much since the 60s and 50s. But yet we talk about crime in the Black community as if it stands alone in itself. And we ignore, in mainstream media, what's ignored is the systems that created these impoverished conditions that naturally lead to desperation, suffering, and more crime. Conditions constructed by racist policies handed down by white people in power. Furthermore, in mainstream media, Black crime is overemphasized and pathologized as a unique phenomena. This term, Black on Black crime, you don't hear the term, X-race on X-race crime anywhere else, right? Only Black on Black crime is a concept, as if Black people are biologically more prone to crime. And truthfully, people of all groups are more likely to commit crimes within their communities against the people they are in close proximity with. Although members of all racial groups commit crimes within their own group, again, only Black on Black crime has been coined as a unique phenomenon. So white violence against the Black community is defended or denied with alternative narratives about what is projected, right? So things like Black on Black crime can kind of speak to Black people as being more violent, more prone to crime, injuring one another, not caring about one another, when the reality is that all races, all people commit crimes among the communities that they belong to. So let's take on the next example, cowboys and Indians. You know, many of us grew up with stories or even viewing movies or shows that depicted white cowboys as the pure and heroic characters. They were the good guys. This same content depicted Indians as an evil group of savages who the cowboys then needed to fight and kill to protect their white communities. The Indians were the enemy, despite the facts of history, which really tell us a story of the mass genocide of Native Americans upon the arrival of white colonizers in America, right? So Indians are depicted as being the violent ones, despite what history tells us. So these are just two examples of how our violent racial history is not acknowledged by those who benefit from or perpetuate it, but rather the violence and heinous behaviors projected into the dark racial other, who then carries the unbearable truth as if they were the ones who perpetuated the injustice. Next slide, please.
And some of that happened with Miss Cooper, right? Like she was the one breaking the rules. She had her dog off leash. Right. And so when, Mr. Cooper said, hey, can you put your dog on the leash? I mean, she lost it because she's the entitled one, okay? She cannot own that, oh, excuse me, I did break this rule. No, you're the rule breaker. That's projection, okay? Right. Something that she couldn't tolerate about herself. Okay, just wanted to say that.
Absolutely, and I welcome more of your comments. I even think about the paramedic who administered the ketamine dose that was 50 pounds over Elijah McClain's weight. And ketamine is a very powerful substance, right? And, and in this moment, he's communicating to the officers, he's complimenting them, telling them he'll do whatever they want. And the projection is just ironclad. It sticks. He needs to be violently held down. He needs he's viewed as bigger and in need of more
yes, absolutely. Exactly.
Higher level of sedation. So we see those dire effects of the projection.
That's right. And and then people will ask, why did you run or why did you flinch? And Elijah could feel. We're animals. He could feel their intention. He could feel their aggression. And he was like, he got slack. I'll do whatever you want. He genuflected. You're beautiful. You're great. Try anything so that he can survive the moment. Even people say, I'm guilty. Just let me live. But that is the projective identity that's coming in, and then you'll identify with it. Maybe I'm wrong, or this Absolutely. Is so complex and complicated. Excuse me, Justin.
Absolutely. We'll move on to projective identification, right? And this is admittedly a really complicated defense mechanism, but let's try to understand it together. So projective identification is a defense mechanism in which the person projecting and the object of the projection, we use the term object in object relations theory, and to describe not so much a particular object, but an entity in which we have a relationship, right? And so really the person, right, of the projection is engaged with the projected material to make sense of themselves within the interaction. An individual projects qualities that are unacceptable to themselves onto another person, and that person internalizes the projected qualities and believes him or herself to be characterized by them appropriately and justifiably. So again, this is a complicated one because it involves two people. And again, first there's a person who projects to get rid of those parts of themselves that are unacceptable. Then there's the identifier. The person who is being projected into begins to behave and identify with how they are treated. So let's take a look at how this diagram, how this process can unfold via diagram. If you'll click once for me, and you can leave it right there. So first, for the white person, or as for law enforcement as an entity that has historically carried out white supremacy interests, there's unbearable knowledge about the history of violence and inequality towards Black people. But there's a difference between knowing something and accepting something. We may know something unconsciously, but to accept something that is known requires conscious or intentional interaction with that knowledge, and to integrate that knowledge into who we are as people. That what it would mean if, so what would it mean, right? If we accepted that law enforcement as an institution was originally established to control and subjugate Black people and continues to do so, whether aware or unaware, through its current approach to policing. What would it mean for the altruistic officer who comes to their job with benevolent intention, really hoping to improve society? The notion alone is often too threatening to consider because it can categorically shift one's perception of themselves and evoke disillusionment. So click once for me. And once more. So to avoid the truth of America's racial context and the sense of threat it poses, projection takes place. That projection contains both the history of violence as well as a sense of personal threat, which is now unconsciously placed into Black people. And the Black people then, by just existing, by being in white spaces or any space in society, become a trigger for the primitive, unintegrated fear and the vulnerability that is evoked by simple truth. The truth told by our history of how Black people have been the receivers of tremendous violence. In the minds of white America, through unconscious projection of that truth, they've often come to fear and then, of course, oppress Black people as if they have historically perpetuated the violence. So click once more for me. Thank you. So that Black person who's receiving these projections then experiences themselves as a bad person, as a second-class citizen, as inferior, because of how they are treated treated as such by law enforcement in various aspects of society. Now, it's important to remember that our sense of self is co-crafted by our own temperament and subjectivity, as well as our experiences with others. As relational beings, we depend on each other's view of us to help understand who we are. Quite literally, the viability of ourselves and our subjectivities is linked to the other human beings with whom we come into contact. If you repeatedly have the experience of being treated as a second-class citizen or as someone malevolent and disruptive in society, despite other aspects of yourself that contradict that narrative, it can create the very kind of self-disillusionment that is avoided through projection. So as the recipient of the projection, you can resolve that disillusionment and have some form of psychological equilibrium, albeit detrimental to oneself, by taking in the projection and becoming more and more of how one is treated. So click once more. So some Black people may identify with the badness, with that sense of inferiority, with their second-class citizenship that is projected into them, to make sense of how and why they are consistently regarded as such. One may think if everyone in my community is being oppressed and I have no other options but to experience this oppression, maybe this is simply the quality of life I am to live. Maybe it's true that I am deserving of this treatment, or what is the point in remaining lawful when I'm already considering the opposite? When I'm already considered the opposite. And while that may resolve the disillusioning experience of how one is treated versus who one is, to take in the projection, unfortunately, it still becomes detrimental, right? Because it offers justification for police officers that Black people then deserve to be over-policed and mistreated. If you click that next step, we'll get into that. Right, when you identify with the projection, although it resolves that disillusionment, protects one's ego, helps one feel more comfortable psychologically, it resolves one threat, but serves again as more rationale for mistreatment. It's also worth noting here again that the person or entity that projects is not aware of what they are projecting. So the identification resolves one issue, but creates so many more. The person projecting can feel even more free of the own qualities or knowledge that they won't accept. And the person who is identified then continues to be treated that way.
Yeah, the person projecting ego continues to be weakened because they're
Yes.
throwing out parts of themselves.
And they become more and more dependent on what is not true.
That's right. And that's not going to work out.
No.
Unless you're in the perverse American path.
Right. Click once more. Thank you. And click again. Great. So then again, right, there's that further mistreatment and injustice suffered at the hands of law enforcement or white society, which can reinforce helplessness and a resignation to a lie of one's own inferiority. So this is projective identification. It describes in some part the relationship that we see between police officers and some parts of our Black community.
Is your next slide, does it talk about when one does not accept the projection, like Mr.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Let's get into that. Get into that. Thank you. Click once, twice, 3 times. So again, we begin with the officer as a representation of the paradigm, the cognitive paradigm that white America operates from, right? Where there's unbearable guilt for the knowledge and violence towards Blacks. They project that guilt out to maintain themselves as good and to rid themselves of disillusionment. And the Black person then experiences themselves through that projection. Click once more. So in this case, though, right, what we have seen more and more of is that Black people reject the projection, which allows us to be more realistic and balanced in our self-appraisal. But the challenge is that a Black person that does not accept that which is too unbearable for white society to accept about themselves poses a threat to the white ego, because then who is going to carry what is unbearable? The white ego then cannot maintain equilibrium by projecting the disturbing reality of our racial context. So one might then have to own their role in institutional oppression and how they benefit from it. Not of everything that happened in the past, but everything that currently is being sustained that offers white people a benefit on the backs of Black people, people of color, who are then the recipients of the oppression and the inequality. And so, of course, that poses a threat to the projector's sense of self. Click once more.
And we could see that happen with Mr. Cooper, who didn't accept the projection.
Yeah.
And he has sturdy ego. He's not porous. He knows who he is. He knows he's the right. I mean, and if you do a little bit of research about him, he's quite esteemed.
Yeah.
And she lost her when he did not take it in. He left it there for her. And you and I have seen this when we leave it on the table for the white other to pick it back up. I mean, there's further attack. I mean, it's infuriation that we're not containing their. That's our job in America.
Right. That is our job. That's part of our second-class citizenship that we've inherited, and that our white dominant society continues to project onto us. That we ought to contain the badness of our past that we suffered through, and the continued inequality that we experience today. That we hold it, that we don't make any noise about it, that we don't assert that Black Lives Matter, because that could somehow disrupt another that could offend someone to say that a Black person matters, right? When we don't take in the projection, there's incredible resistance. And what Carol, I believe her name is Carol Anderson, calls white rage, that book White Rage, right? The retaliation.
That's
right. Ideally, when a Black person doesn't accept the projection, there would be a decrease in the projection, and white society, the officer, law enforcement alike, could mentalize and take in and see the other as human. But instead, mentalization and integration often don't happen. Rather than accepting this part of oneself, what happens often through that rage, there's a doubling down.
Yeah.
Through that threat of accepting what is an unbearable truth, there's a doubling down on the projection to force a justification for the mistreatment of the Black person. And this allows them to avoid conscious acknowledgement that of the heinous crimes against Black folks, and it allows them to rid themselves of unwanted feelings and maintain psychological equilibrium in a way that continues to be both inequitable to others and also very fragile. Click once more.
And dehumanizing for themselves too.
Absolutely.
Bad.
To that end, right, I think about how many white folks live in all white spaces, right, and section off from tons of people of color, right? There's a detachment, right? There's a detachment from other parts of society that can happen for this in part for this reason here that we're seeing, because you don't want to live next to the person that you're projecting into. You have to be reminded of what you're trying to get rid of. And this all happens on an unconscious level, we believe.
Yeah.
Right. And so when there's that doubling down, there's an exacerbated Black rage, justified Black rage, and civil disobedience, right? Those feelings
and Black rage is not just for Black people. We see Black rage in youth of all ethno-racial cultures, and we appreciate, that the humanity that is expressed in those moments. Mm-hmm.
Right. I truly do believe this notion that, and I guess it was King's notion, injustice anywhere, and injustice anywhere, right? Is injustice everywhere.
Yes.
And we can see other groups fighting for their inequality as well. And we know that fight is our fight too.
That's right. That's right.
If you click once more, it just shows the cycle. It continues, exacerbated Black rage and a doubling down of the projection. And this, we believe, is part of the issue that we have in our the Black community's relationship with law enforcement, or vice versa. Next slide.
Okay, so we recognize that it's getting late, and we appreciate those of you who have stayed with us. What Dr. Hopkins and Dennis have just reviewed is quite sophisticated, and this is the kind of concept that is taught in residency, and even among psychiatry residents, it can be difficult to grasp initially, and so it requires going over and over again. But we share it because this is what is operating in society. It happens between us and others, and it certainly is happening between police officers. So I'm going to shift to what this means and how this affects the conscience. And I'll try to address that rather succinctly, and then Dr. Isom is going to address efforts to reform policing. And so while it's beyond the concept, the scope of this venue, since Dr. Dennis has introduced it, I'm just going to say something about the superego. And just in short, this is what all of us have. And the superego represents our conscience, our laws, our rules, and that usually is in place by the time we're 5. We learn that from our families. And the id represents our desire to do whatever feels good. And children really illustrate that well. They want to eat, they'll eat a whole box of cookies, they want to bite, they want to do whatever causes them to feel good at the time. And our ego is what helps us to mediate between what we want to do and what we should do. And that's where the conscience comes in. So here's the deal. And let me say this on behalf of our group. We appreciate those women and men who regard their work as law enforcement officers as honorable work, and they get up each day and come with true service in mind, and they put their lives on the line in the course of duty. We also recognize that the average age of a cadet, I believe, is about 24. And in psychology, 24 is considered an adolescent. I know when you were probably 21, 22, you thought you were grown, but the brain is still developing. And so we're really talking about adolescents who are also vulnerable. Here is a quote, and what it refers to is that these cadets and later law enforcement officials, ultimately, because of everything that we've described, they carry out law enforcement's function. And as a result, they're being used by society as a vehicle. They're being used by people in power and by proxy, those who support people in power to sustain things, to express things as they are, and to sustain a system which is of white supremacy. And in so doing, what Dr. Hopkins and Dr. Dennis just went through is, as a result, they protect an unintegrated, unacknowledged, fragile white ego that continues to project and criminalize the racial other, rather than mentalizing, in other words, seeing the other's humanity and accepting their role in the recurring trauma that they're called to address. And this dynamic further affords a fragmented sense of law, order, and morality as the principles of humane treatment and fairness ultimately don't apply to Black citizens. And so the ultimate question is, well, why is that? We do know that, let's go to the next slide. We do know that there has been some research on police officers. And in her 2005 paper, Police Personality, What Is It and Why Are They Like That? The author, Twersky Glasner, wrote that the debate over this, the question of individual police versus personality, the debate over this has been mainly over the issues of definition and development. And in other words, what is a police personality and how does it form? Is it a predisposition or is it something that is created by the work itself? And so one of the things that her work shows is that police officers, and this is to address the public's fear that rogue officers are being deliberately recruited. We know some bad apples are getting through, but what she summarizes from her research is the following. Police officers undergo strict screening to weed out, that is to eliminate those candidates who are psychologically unfit, just overtly psychologically unfit. The recruited officer is expected to have a stable sense of self, and is expected to be able to modulate his or her feelings, that is, be able to also manage negative, uncomfortable emotions. But she also finds that police officers are suspicious people who may find it hard to trust others and who tend to end up isolating themselves and have a risk of compartmentalizing their feelings. There are 3 primary components of their personality, and one is related to danger, authority, and efficiency. And it is thought that what is expected during community policing, the sense of authority, which is perceived and real, but that sense of authority separates the officer from the community that he or she patrols and leads to his or her feeling isolated and alienated. So we talk about a desire for community policing, but ultimately what happens is there's a development of an us versus them mindset, when the officer leaves the station. And it's further reinforced by the feelings of solidarity that he or she experiences with the fellow officers. Let's go to the next slide. So she also, in looking at the police personality and the police culture, what she suggests is that there is this occupational socialization that does generate a police personality. And it's thought that the unique subculture, the conditions, the demands of the job create a working personality, which ultimately becomes a situation where the officer adopts an insider versus outsider structure. And as a result, they become vigilant, meaning, constantly watching those outside, and they become skeptical of non-police officers, those who are not part of the force. Next slide. So, what we have established is that the history of racism very much contributes to law enforcement's inability to truly mentalize, and that is to truly see and attune to Black, Brown, and other marginalized people. And we also see that the process of indoctrination into police culture and the ensuing conduct undermines our ability to see officers as individuals. And so ultimately, they end up being simply the police or the police, depending on where you live. And but let me just address this quote here. In short, this is from the Cato Institute. And what it says is that, in short, the policymakers around the country have finally started to realize that qualified immunity has undermined accountability for public officials, and they are concerned. And let me just address what that concern is about. If police officers are recruited and indoctrinated, and there's a culture that sanctions the acting out of aggressive and lethal impulses, there is a loss of confidence in our legal and judicial structures. There's also a creep in behavior, which we referred to before, resulting in an increase in hate crimes, vigilante violence, and an increase in domestic terrorism. And fundamentally, there's the dehumanization of the objects, leading to aggressive rhetoric, violence, and killings. And so, I think it's easy to see the concern about the Black, Brown, and marginalized person becoming dehumanized, but qualified immunity is symbolic of an artificially created superego, artificially created conscience. And so this instinct to protect the privileged members of society is reinforced, and there's a stronger inclination to dehumanize the victim group. And so instead of developing a strong ego, which is your ability to mediate between what you want to do and what you should do, that becomes weaker because there are no consequences for behavior that in any other setting certainly would be prosecuted. But there's a price to be paid. For this, dehumanization is a bidirectional process. So we no longer see individual officers. We are at risk of generally seeing a dangerous blue shield. And that's what we mean by dehumanization. So, I go out into Starbucks, I see a police officer at the supermarket, I say, hello, officer. However, I think increasingly, we're not seeing individuals, we're seeing a dangerous blue shield. And for this reason, we should be very, very concerned. Let me turn it over to Dr. Isom, and we'll close out.
Thank you, Dr. Dunlap. I'm going to just briefly make some comments on current recommendations to reform policing, and also just some comments on what kind of police force we're working with and what aspects of that force have not yet been really aggressively addressed. And the first thing I want to start out by doing is that latter part. There's been 2 reports that were released detailing, this one from last year, from 2020 in The Guardian, that there are members of the police force who've been actively participating in activities consistent with white supremacist organizations, nationalist, nativist organizations, and very, very extreme right-wing activities. And there's been investigations into their social media posts demonstrating the kinds of rhetoric that they've been spouting and the different behaviors that they've been engaged in. But what's really interesting about both of these reports, the second one's from the Brenner Center for Justice, is that what happens in response to the recognition of their participation is really contingent upon scandal. So that if there's a public scandal, then in that specific instance, a department who is already aware of their participation in these activities will then actually address and meter out consequences for those. But outside of an actual public scandal, there's no real disciplinary action, there's no real termination, despite there being some connection between police officers and these very problematic groups. The second thing I want to introduce to you all is a report that everyone should review. This was one effort among many to reform police and address some of those present day consequences that we're contending with. And this actually came out during the Obama presidency. He created a task force on 21st century policing, gave them 90 days to come up with some of the recommendations for policing practices, and also some recommendations to actually effectively reduce crime while at the same time investing in building public trust. So in that period of 90 days, they held listening sessions, they invited people from the community, law enforcement officers, academics, a whole wide swath of people. And they came up with these 6 pillars rooted in those diverse voices offering their insights and input. And just to name those pillars for you all, but also to encourage you all to dive more deeply into the report, what they came up with as focus areas included number 1, building trust and legitimacy. Number 2, officer training and education. Number 3, policy and oversight. Number 4, technology and social media. Number 5, community policing. And number 6, officer safety and wellness. And that last portion of things is very relevant to the conversation that we're having today. We do have to talk about officer safety and wellness, and we can offer comments on that in the discussion in a way that shines light on why that would be important for mitigating how racialized police violence manifests itself in their policing practices. The last thing I'll offer you with as far as commentary is that we often in the US context don't recognize the global impression that we have. And one of this other videos that you all should watch that we would recommend, only about 7 minutes, but it's a powerful description of how others view us here and the way that our officers interact with the community. One of the quotes from that is, "I'm speechless." This is from a law enforcement officer in another country who's watching videos about George Floyd, watching the militarization of police, and just essentially being speechless and shocked in response to that, but also looking at the stance of police in the community and seeing that it's very adversarial when they're supposed to be people who are serving our communities. So we encourage you to check that specific video out. And then, of course, we have to leave you with a quote from one of our favorite persons, James Baldwin. This is from his 1955 piece, Notes of a Native Son. And I offer this to anyone in the audience, and you can share it widely, I do all the time, who is sitting in their guilt, because that's not a productive thing to do. So he offers, "I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it, and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it, taking responsibility and accountability, because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it for the very same reason." That should be the anthem of 2020. So with that, I'll pass it to our moderator for the question and answer session.
All right. All right, I'm back. Thank you all, Dr. Dennis, Dr. Dunlap, Dr. Hopkins, Dr. Isom, for such a stimulating presentation. There are a few things that came up in the presentation that were notable. The first was early on when Dr. Dunlap, you mentioned not seeing results and not trusting. And so the question that came up after that is really, how do we see, or how do we learn to see the other?
Well, we hope that this presentation helps people to see the defense mechanisms that they use, especially Dr. Hopkins and Dr. Dennis really illustrated what happens. For example, when we're busy projecting onto others, we're giving them qualities that don't belong to them. I mean, that's the first obstacle to being able to see someone. And as I also said, this happens in other relationships, but I think that just acknowledging that we need to take time to actually, try to see who is in front of us.
Mhm.
But it does require recognizing your anxiety and then
Mhm.
taking steps to do something different.
Mhm.
And also recognizing the bias, recognizing bias and prejudice.
Mhm. 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 And so you mentioned taking time to see others and taking time also to see ourselves. One thing that Dr. Dennis mentioned as she was starting her portion of the presentation for the very first time was really kind of acknowledging what was going on in her body and how she was feeling. And I'm wondering if we have any comments about just embodiment and how it is that we take care of ourselves, use our bodies in our work, how we encourage those who might have listened all the way through to move forward this evening and tomorrow.
Is that for anyone?
For anyone, for
Oh,
anyone.
I thought it was for the chat. Yeah, I would agree with you, Dr. D'Souza, that one of the most important things to be able to see the other accurately is to see oneself accurately. So your position and perspective is going to either give you clarity or delude you.
Mhm.
So, having emotional intelligence, a sturdy enough ego. I mean, there's so many things about me that I don't like, but it's important for me to know that so that I don't project it onto the other and having them carry the weight. Projection is so destructive in relationships, in any kind, at any level.
Mhm.
I can offer a very specific example of projection that I worked through in therapy during my residency, projective identification. I was in clinical settings with people, and someone would make a very problematic comment specifically about race. I would say something about that comment, and how I felt in that moment was that I was the party pooper and the aggressor towards everyone else in the space, because I had inserted something that kind of ruined the fun for all. And one of the things that my therapist said is like, wait, aren't they aggressing against you, right? They're offering something into the space that's actually violent towards you, and you've absorbed that, and it felt that way for me. And that was one of the ways that I was able to process what it feels like to be in spaces and to be someone that's more vocal about things that are problematic and how uncomfortable that can feel.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing that. I totally resonated with a couple of the speakers when they talked about how difficult it has been to process this material. And I'm wondering, just for the purposes of those who are watching and listening, might we share how this kind of material affects us and maybe the persons that we work with?
Yeah, if I could share briefly, and my comments are in part to the previous question and this one as well.
Mhm.
I think in order to mentalize and break down our projections, we have to mourn. We have to really feel the heartbreak of recognizing just how inhumane, violent, and eviscerating racism is, and accept the truth as it is, so that we don't continue to live in a different kind of reality, right? A reality that is whitewash or that precludes certain parts of history. We should learn all of our history. We should learn about all aspects of American life and how it affects us, how it affected us then and how it continues to affect us now. And I think that's the only way that we can really heal and really integrate, is mourn and wrestle with what is emotionally challenging. And for those who experience that challenge, and experience that heartbreak, however you feel is okay. It's okay to feel sad, down, overwhelmed, hopeless even, or helpless, angry. It's okay to feel all of those. Feel those, allow those feelings will make meaning of those feelings for yourself. Understand what those emotions are about. Take the time to reflect and take the space to really think and be with yourself in your body as you feel those emotions. And from there, allow them to guide you to take steps towards breaking down our racist system in whatever capacity you can during the course of your life.
Let me add to that. In this notion of mentalization, I mean, mentalization is a fancy word, and it's more complex than what we presented. but it does capture being aware of your own feelings, as has been said, and being aware of your own issues in order to see somebody else. And so I think that, one of the things that we are demonstrating by addressing this topic, I can say that we did not know much about qualified immunity. And so we decided to do some research. In other words, what is this about, as opposed to just repeating what has been said? And so that also means being humble enough to say you don't know. We're pretty good at that because we know we need to acknowledge what we don't know so that we can be confident about what we do know. And so getting information, actually helps you to have a sense of how you really feel about something. And so, but that requires some humility.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dunlap. Was there another comment that someone wanted to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out there for everyone that, after sitting through the content from this kind of presentation, and as someone who has presented twice today on similarly challenging topics around racism in our history, it's really important to have a recovery plan for what you do after. So for those in the audience, there's a really helpful toolkit from Boston University called hashtag racial trauma is real, and it's specifically around recovering from racial trauma. And one might consider that even just being exposed to this kind of content can be re-traumatizing for people in the audience. So I would encourage you all to check that out. They have a racism recovery plan, which alludes to or directly explicitly acknowledges some of what Dr. Hopkins was mentioning, paying attention to what's happening in your body, how it's connected to what you're feeling and the effect it's having on you and your ability to function. And then it makes very specific recommendations for how you can be a caretaker for yourself in response to those exposures. I think we all should have a racism recovery plan. Everyone on this panel has a racism recovery plan of some sort. And I encourage you all to take that away as something else meaningful from the time that we spent together as well.
Thank you all.
I just want to add something else. I hope you can still hear me because my AirPods are draining down.
I can hear you, Dr. Dunlap.
Okay. So one of the questions is about, again, how we take care of ourselves. And I want to go back to something that Dr. Dennis mentioned, and she referred to justified rage. One of the ways that we're dealing with just the enormous challenges and the very painful centuries of pain that we are talking about is by using that rage constructively. I mean, we call it sublimation, but actually feeling that you can do something causes you to not feel so helpless. And let me just say that, for example, this team, and this includes Dr. DeSouza as well, this is one of the ways that we actually take care of ourselves, by doing what we can to educate others. Now, also connected to that is, the need for, some other downtime and self-care. But the people who are actually out protesting, they're actually doing that so that they don't feel hopeless and helpless. Just using that justified rage to propel them.
Mm-hmm. It's an excellent point, and it's an excellent place to actually close. It's a way of kind of moving into action, which we hope that this, while it's educational, inspires you to do. So really thank you all to our speakers, Dr. Dennis, Dr. Dunlap, Dr. Hopkins, Dr. Isom. For those of you who have been online with us the whole time live, who have commented, we encourage you to rewatch whichever portions of this that you can when you're able to, and for the rest of this evening, take care of yourselves. Have a wonderful evening. We have here, just in the slides that are going to be shown, references. You can just go ahead, Jessica, as we kind of flip through very quickly. And there are video, book, podcast references. And then we have some information on how you might be able to contact the panelist if you so choose. So we'll drop the information. We're going to try to drop it right into the chat right now. So you'll be able to see that online as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Be well and take care.